Now we began first with testing value statements. Should the city not sell public land to private interests? And there it was fairly definitive, 61% to 31% agreeing with that. We can take that as one of the foundation values then that your residents come with into play. The value of public land is greater than simple revenue. Again, we see that 2 to 1, 58 to 30%. Should the city look to generate revenue, however, from any public land that is sold or put into use, and 61 to 35 again. You can see on these three then we have about 60% who are saying, let's treat public land gingerly. Let's not sell it outright to private interests. We have to keep in mind that the value of public land is greater than revenue as a whole, and we also have to look to generate revenue if we are going to think about putting current public land that's not in use into use. Now, strong opinions about the purpose. If the public land is going to be put into play, it should be for public purposes only. Community amenities in particular was a term that came up time and time again in discussing, in going through the survey. Now, do people feel you have enough park space? Well, what we found in most communities is that the appetite for park space is pretty insatiable. Your folks come closest, though, to an even split that we found anywhere across the metro area. So 53% agreed there is enough park space, 44% indicated that they disagreed with that. We've done similar surveys. Burnsville would be a very good place to point to. The amount of public space or park space in Burnsville is one of the highest per capita across the metro area. Yet when we asked the same question in Burnsville, what we found was that we had 60% disagreement that there was enough park space. Again, folks here feel that you do have enough, but it really is split. This isn't saying that we don't need more. It isn't saying that we ought to go out and acquire more, but it's certainly indicating that at least 40% of the residents here are skeptical about the amount of park space you have, but more to the point, as marginal comments tended to indicate, they're concerned about maintaining that level of park space within the community. Is the sense of community here important? And that's the highest we've had anywhere across the metropolitan area. It bears out the other surveys we've done for the Edina Public Schools and for the city of Edina. 93% agreed with that statement, only 6% disagreed. Since we guaranteed anonymity, we can't give you the names and addresses of that 6% that disagreed, but we did find out in many cases that they were going to be moving shortly, so they won't be something you need to contend with for that many more years. Now, should there be more community space within the city? Should there be more gathering spaces? And here we've got 55% saying yes, but 42% are saying no. That doesn't strike people as much of a concern as more recreational opportunities, and of course the high point, more cultural and arts opportunities. A theme that came through in terms of the questions throughout the survey was the need for more cultural and art opportunities. There certainly is a constituency, a very large constituency within your city residents who are focused on that and feel that the city does need more of those types of facilities. We asked people what facilities would they like to see improved in the city of Edina. And you've got 42% who said nothing needs to be improved in the city of Edina. 8% were unsure, but the interesting point in this response pattern is that you have nothing heading into the 20-25% range. That by and large, we're looking at very, very small numbers, and in terms of the number of answers, it's scattered. In many other communities that we worked with, there will be one or two, maybe even three types of facilities that people will focus on. That's not the case here. In terms of improvement, people would like to see some park improvements. This was a point in the survey where we had testimony on certain parks and the adequacy of certain swing sets and that kind of thing. And bicycle lanes tended to be something that Folks wanted to see improvements. They thought the rollout, and we're not familiar with the background on this, of your bicycle lanes was not as smooth as it might have been. But those are the only two that come in at around 10%. The rest of these we consider to be background noise, something to be aware of, but certainly not at a point yet where you'll galvanize a significant percentage of the citizens behind that particular facility. Now, what about facilities to add? Okay, now here we have the community center coming in. 11% indicated they'd like to see the community center either expanded or added to. 7% indicated the bicycle lanes again. But again, we're down to very, very small numbers. This was open-ended. We have 50% that are saying, I can't think of anything that I'd add to. In fact, there's nothing I would add to or put an addition on. And 9% are unsure. Again, very scattered pattern. The 11% community center is a little bit low. So that put a yellow flag out for us in terms of what the support levels were going to be like and where exactly your population is with respect to the community center. And we'll get into that more and more. We have comparative data, which I'll be bringing to bear with, we worked with the city of Shoreview on its community center, Maplewood, Chaska, and I'm forgetting one, Andover. And we can make comparisons then in terms of where those residents were in terms of the community center with where you are currently. Familiarity with the Grandview District, we explained first where it was and then asked people how familiar are you with it. And we've got 86% who indicated they were familiar. 46% kind of moaned and groaned and said, oh yes, I'm very familiar with it, particularly at rush hour. And 14% indicated they weren't familiar at all. So when we're talking about the Grandview District, you've got good awareness in terms of exactly what part of the community you're talking about. How often do people visit the Grandview District? Your residents split into three groups of relatively equal size. Those that were there more than weekly are 36% of your residents. If we look at the weekly to 2 or 3 times a month, that is more than monthly, we've got 31%. And if we take a look at the rare visitor, monthly, less than once a month or never, we're at 33%. In looking at this, there's a difference in terms of opinions with respect to facilities and what ought to be there and that kind of thing, depending on how often you're actually visiting the area. So we'll bring this slide up more in terms of discussing the rest of the questions with differences between these three groups. But keeping in mind, I'm going to call frequent visitors those that are there more than weekly. We'll call occasional visitors those that are there weekly to 2 or 3 times a month. And we'll call rare visitors those that are there a monthly or even less. Are people aware of the Grandview redevelopment framework? 46% said no. They had not heard about it at all. So you've got roughly 50% of the residents who are aware that something's going on with respect to Grandview redevelopment. 36% are at least somewhat familiar. 18% said, yes, I'm aware something's going on, but I know very, very little about it. So the total awareness currently among residents, you've got a good third of the residents who know that something's going on and self-identify themselves as being, yeah, I'm familiar with what's going on. Again, we use those groups as we take a look at other questions. So I'll be talking about very familiar and somewhat familiar and then everybody else. Are there development preferences? Do people want public amenities in that area, on that land, or do they want private uses? Or do they want a combination? We gave them 3 options. We give people the combination option because that usually turns out to be where most folks are. But the other 2 choices are suggestive, and in this case, strongly suggestive. Public amenities only, and strongly for public amenities is 37%. Those folks that want just private use of that area are less than 10%. They're 9%. You have, though, 46% in the combination category. So if we're looking at mixed use is appropriate, but you would want to make sure that that public component, the public amenities, are there and have a major presence in any mixed-use development. What about indoor versus outdoor public amenities? I always worry about asking this in a Minnesota winter, but given the timing, and in looking at your results versus what we found in particular in Shoreview, what we've got is that 57% want a combination. Again, no surprise there. And the tilt now is toward indoor facilities. Outdoor, very, very little support for only outdoor facilities. Much more for indoor. But again, we're looking at people who are saying, well, can't we have both? So we've got mixed use as kind of a lead-in now, or a theme that we'll be pursuing, and also a preference toward indoor rather than outdoor. Now, this is a busy chart, and I apologize for it. We read a list of potential uses for the land, and we asked people, well, would you agree with that use? Would you strongly agree, somewhat agree, strongly oppose, or somewhat oppose? They could also tell us that they don't know, they have no opinion. So that's why when we go through, you'll find that some of these do not add necessarily to 100. If we take a look at office space, for example, we're at 98%. You might ask, well, where's the rest? Those are the folks that really were undecided about that use. What we've done in the array here is to move from the things that are more strongly supportive down to the things that are more adamantly opposed. And there's two things. Let's do the bottom of the chart first. Any attempt to put apartments into onto that land would be met with a lot of pushback. The blowback on apartments would be particularly severe. Whenever we see a 65% opposition figure, we tend to red flag that one really quickly. You can also see that apartments are only at 35% as being a use that people would like to see made of that land. Well, where we tend to cut the line in terms of, okay, these are really the key things that people would be motivated and would get behind. We would draw the line at 65%, we'll go to 64, above 60% in favor and below 40% opposed. So you have four things, or four potential uses that have very, very solid support. The first thing is the outdoor plaza and park. The second, sit-down restaurants. The third, retail shops. And the fourth, performing arts space. As you can see then, the opposition goes up into the 40s and up into the high 40s until we hit the townhomes, condos, and apartments at the bottom. We also see that those in favor now have gone below 60, moving to 59 down to 51. Why do we call those top four the bedrock of any proposal? Well, it's through experience in terms of working with cities in referenda and also in working in land use planning with comprehensive plans for communities. When things get into that less than 60% support and more than 40% opposition, it's a fluid situation. It can change very, very rapidly, and we've had experiences where actually it's swung from support to opposition over the course of a month and a half discussion. So the four that are solid are the top four. We would also strongly recommend, if it's possible to, avoiding the bottom two. Again, this is just looking at it from a public relations or information point of view. The apartments in particular is what we call a door slammer, in that if apartments are part of the proposal, it's going to shut people off immediately. And they won't even stick around to hear what the rest of the proposal is. Now, if we go through a list like that, it can be very confusing because everything but two on that list were supported by majorities. So now we're asking people, okay, let's go through the list again. What's your first choice and what's your second choice? We also asked them which is the thing that they would most oppose. But let's take a look first at what the two items were that people chose. The dark green are first choices, the light green second choices. You'll notice one thing again, in that nothing hits above 25%. You've got no consensus item up there with respect to 50%, indicating that's their first or second choice. In terms of the intensity, the first choice, fairly limited. The high is 14%, and as we come down, we've got 5 that are 10% or above. But how does that match up to the earlier one in terms of opposition and support? The outdoor plaza and park, very popular concept. The exercise and fitness center now has moved into a component that should be considered, and we're going to see that coming into play a little bit more in terms of a community center. The performing arts space we've already talked about. You have a very, very strong performing arts group. The arts center with gallery, same kind of thing. And then finally, the indoor pool and play area at 17%. We tend to draw the line when that goes below 10% in terms of first choices. Think about the dark green as being the impact of the item and the enthusiasm that it can generate. Again, are there things that are lower on the board? We would have expected to see apartments lower, and in fact we see it, 3% and 4%. Condos and townhomes, 9% and 6%. So not as intense opposition, but certainly not within the top 5 in terms of what people would like to see in that district. Now, if we're looking at priority of potential uses, what's most opposed? And this is where we're looking for red flags that could doom an entire project. Anytime that goes above 20 to 25%, we've got a concern, a major concern. And as you can see, apartments is right up there at 26%. Other than that, everything else is coming in at 12% or lower. None of those would be considered what we would call a project stopper. The only thing that would be controversial would be apartments as a component. Anytime we're less than 15% in opposition, we consider that to be moderate opposition. If it goes below 10, it's very, very minor opposition. And you can see that most of the items on that chart are below 10%. Now, how do people feel about a new community center? And this was a concept question. We didn't talk about taxes. We just said, would you support or oppose the building of a new community center in Edina? 53% indicated support. 40% indicated opposition. This is a snag right away. The community at this point is just not highly in favor. We're looking at concept. If we start putting tax numbers on this, then immediately we're going to lose some of those that are favoring it in concept. Where we were hoping to see this was at 60% minimum on the support side. And in terms of the opposition, you're at 40. At the outside, we like to see that coming in at less than 30. So at least at this point in the discussion within the community itself, you haven't generated the support levels needed. Now that's something that can in fact change over time depending on the kinds of communications that are going on. But in addition, if we take a look at strong support and strong opposition, the intensities are also somewhat wrong. They're about even with a little bit of an advantage to the strong opponents. That also is a little bit worrisome because those are the folks that are going to come forward and basically be there in support or in opposition. The intense group is always the key in referenda. And here you're equally divided. In fact, you're starting out about 3 points behind. So this was just in concept. We haven't talked about taxes. Now, what did the supporters say they wanted to see in the community center? The fitness center was important to 30% of them. the Performing Arts Center at 20%, the indoor pool at 16%, and meeting rooms at 14%. Each of those would be the kinds of things that would reinforce initial support for the community center. Would people be likely to use the community center, members of their household? And what we found was that 54% were at least somewhat likely to use the community center. But in projecting now, and we have to use a marketing discount on those because intention is not necessarily actually going out and changing your behavior. We'd estimate that 18% of the community would be initially using the community center. Well, now how about property tax increases? This is our let's make a deal question. If you remember that old TV show, we start at a random point and people can tell us higher, higher, or lower, lower. We start at $8 and people say no, we then ask them about 6. If they say no again, we go to 4. If they say yes to that, okay, that's where we mark them down. If at $8 they were to say yes, well, how about 10? And we then use that kind of starting at a random point and then moving up and down depending on what they're telling us to arrive at the distribution of preferences on the tax increase. Now the key on this is the median. That is what the typical respondent would in fact pay. And if you look at that chart, the thing that probably catches your eye is the 38% block at nothing. These were folks that said I would not pay anything at the outset, or that when we said $2, it immediately went no. You've got almost 40% who are saying that they would pay nothing. What that's going to do then is drag down that median point. And the median would be, in terms of expectation to pay, would be about $3.28 per month. So about $36 per year. What was interesting to us on this is that was exactly the median point at Shoreview when they first tested going for a community center. Same kind of thing. We can also get a soft property tax increase figure. We know that from surveys that we've done and from going in after elections, that only about 50% of the nothings actually tend to vote. So we could knock that down and reduce that a bit. That, though, doesn't give you much wiggling room because, as you can see, your two major blocks are $2 and $4. 12% said $6, but we're looking at a high end to the property tax increase potential of about $4.06. Again, not much, $3.28 versus $4.06. If we multiply it by 12, then we're up to $48. But exactly what can you do with a $48 tax increase on the average household? But it's telling you that this one is saying, and in particular given the opposition that we saw in concept, that you're either going to need a really good, solid communications effort to get more people into supporting the concept, and then from there making sure that you don't tip up toward the $10 figure where only 9% of the folks in the city are going to support one that high. We then asked about a mixed-use project and defined it for residents. And what we found was that 65% would support mixed use. 29% would oppose. So you've got better than 2 to 1 in favor. The interesting thing on this is that the intense opinions are very, very low. That is very little strong support, very little strong opposition. And the amenities to include as far as your supporters are concerned for mixed use is restaurants, a community center, boutique shops, condos, and big box retail. Those are the kinds of things that people would like to see brought into a mixed use project in the area. We took a look at 2 different arguments that might change people's opinion of their support for the community center. And the first one...
You want me to read it?
Yeah, why don't you?
All right. So the first one was asked after this was the community center. argument. And it said, with the population of Edina continuing to grow, there is a strong possibility the current Edina Community Center and Normandale Road may be converted back into classrooms for students in the future. Knowing this, would you be much more likely to support a new community center project at the former Grandview Public Works site? Somewhat more likely, somewhat less likely? Or does it make no difference?
And we have 55% who say under those circumstances I would be more likely to support. If you're going to take the current one we've got away from me, then I'd like another one. Only 7% were less likely, and they were less likely to do so. The marginal comments on this one were fascinating.
I bet.
They didn't like the idea that you're turning that back into a school. So as a result, they were going to oppose it because they didn't like that idea. And finally, the no difference folks I don't consider that to be a relevant argument one way or another. But when you do have 55% saying I would be more likely to support, that is a little bit of a game changer in terms of that's a very, very solid argument if in fact the school district is thinking about taking back the old high school.
Okay, so then the second argument was asked after the mixed use discussion. And it said a mixed-use project with the privately owned components like residential units or office space on a portion of this site could reduce the potential tax impact of constructing and operating a community center on the same site. Knowing this.
Now you can see that again we've got a majority of people saying I'd be more likely to support the community center if in fact that revenue is going to come in. 12% indicated that they were less likely, and 34% indicated that it made no difference. The 12% this time, we're talking about the fact, well, I think we ought to do other things with the revenue that might be coming in. In particular, a fair chunk of them were saying, well, why don't we reduce my property taxes with that new revenue coming in? Now, here, 20% of the opponents indicated they were more likely. So again, we're getting fairly significant swings. But the argument that really does make a major difference is if the current community center is in jeopardy of being converted back to a school. So exactly what can we say? The Supreme Court would say that this issue is not ripe in terms of there being one path that your residents are endorsing or agreed upon. But there certainly are limits in terms of boundaries that they're setting with respect to what they would like to see. Let's deal with the community center first. The community center, more engagement of that issue is absolutely essential so that more folk can take a position one way or another, and we can see exactly whether or not with additional information more people would be supportive. If that information campaign shows no change, if it doesn't move the needle, then that's going to tell you something right off the bat. If it does, however, start changing the needle, then that would be to the good in terms of building support if you decide to go in that direction. Otherwise, with the numbers you're looking at currently, it would not survive a referendum election, just pure and simple. The mixed use planning, certainly there's a lot of support for it. We just have to make sure that certain uses are incorporated in any plan and that certain uses are minimized in any plan. Again, you've got a broad set of things that people would love to see in a mixed use development. There's only two things I think that we struck off the list. And you've got a lot of freedom in terms of how you want to develop that mixed-use site. Now, the community center, as part of that mixed-use site, certainly would be something to consider. But you've actually got two things going on here, two separate lines. One is the community center by itself. Since that's going to require tax money, I would expect, it would be necessary then to almost run a secondary information campaign on exactly what we're talking about with respect to a community center. My goodness, I'm forgetting the name of the city, Chaska. put its community center in. It didn't have to go to the electorate. They have a municipal utility. And so they were able to use those funds to build it. What they did, though, given the splits in terms of the community center and the findings, which in some ways were similar to yours, they ran a full-bore campaign. It was as if a referendum were going to occur. They had an information campaign going on. They had grassroots effort behind it. There was no vote, but nevertheless, by the time that a referendum would have occurred, we went back and did another survey for them and found that 60% were supporting it and 40% were enthusiastic about it. That's the kind of thing you're probably looking at with the community center. Now, on the land use planning, the mixed uses do make sense, and there's a whole series of them that certainly would be more than welcome. Keep in mind, though, that you do have two groups, two readily identifiable groups that would be active in any mixed-use proposal coming forward, and that's the art group, and also, then I include the Art Center also with the performing arts space, and the recreational group. There's some overlap there, but in terms of making sure that the key constituencies are in fact on board for a development, it's going to be necessary to make sure that all of those key constituencies see a stake in what's being proposed.
Would this be the classic example where in this case the art people and the recreation people, if they bonded together to go out and really create a campaign, would have a better success than if they individually went out and did campaigns?
And it certainly would be better than just having the arts people or the recreation people going out. Yeah, that synergism would be great. In terms of most people don't expect to see that in, and this is basically what, if you think back on school district referenda, that's exactly what occurs in terms of there's constituencies, there's silos, and an appeal is made to each silo. I think in Washington we call that log rolling. Yet it does work in terms of getting at those folks that are actively committed to a particular cause, whether it's arts, whether it's recreation, taking the further step of going out and actually working in favor and support of a proposal.
Very interesting.
It's really fascinating. Actually.
I have a question. You said you were going to talk about demographics, how these things split out demographically.
Oh, I'm sorry, I really didn't touch on that, did I? The age demographics really did play exactly as you would expect to see them. So, for example, if we take a look at who the fitness center tends to be the most important to, it would skew toward people over the age of 40, 45.
Younger families?
Younger families, it wasn't as big with them as it was with respondents that were in that age category. Now, of course, that was a very, very popular item if we go back and take a look on the chart. Where the younger families tended to come down, they liked the idea of the play areas and the indoor pool. They also liked disproportionately the indoor athletic courts. The outdoor plaza and park people were all over the board. That one, people just really like the idea of that being contained within the mixed-use planning. Sit-down restaurants is where your families begin to appear. And when we've asked what do you have in mind with a sit-down restaurant, what we tend to find in Edina, we've asked that question on behalf of the city in past surveys. They want a nice restaurant, but we're not talking Ruth Chris's. We're not talking
Applebee's either.
Yeah, we're not talking Applebee's either.
Yeah.
But we're talking somewhere in the middle. And let's see. That would be it in terms of the potential things to include in mixed-use planning. The Performing Arts Center had wider support than I would have expected to see. That had key support among your empty nesters. But again, given the education level in this community, it's really no surprise. So you had the empty nesters adding to families containing school-age children, not necessarily preschoolers, who really thought that center was a great idea. And that poor multi-purpose rooms just kind of fell between the cracks. Nobody really understood what that was. It's a meeting room. Well, why do we need a meeting room?
But isn't that, wouldn't that be typical? I mean, do you see that in other communities as well? Because, I mean, meeting rooms don't have constituencies as a rule.
They don't, but there are some communities, when you get out in the third and fourth ring, that don't have the facilities.
Yeah, where they have nothing.
They have nothing.
Yeah.
So people will get, when you have nothing, you get excited about it. And there can be the demand. But when you get closer in the city, a meeting room really is a collective yawn. It is
That's not to say people are opposing
opposed to
it.
it. But
It's just that, I somewhat support it.
Yeah.
Sure. So the other, I guess that makes sense. The other piece of it, getting to sort of the apartments and that whole thing, and I get how apartments can get a certain reaction, but there would be nothing, I'm trying to get to is sort of the level of, and then you said this is pretty consistent in most communities, right?
Yes.
So it's
Yeah.
not, one of the discussions we've had is, you try to balance a district where you kind of create activity all the time. People wouldn't be thinking about any of that. They're strictly like their reaction to that type of housing. I mean, do they have what you call the marginal comments? Do they say what their concern is?
Density.
Is density or type of people, or is it just?
Congestion?
When we first started surveying here about a decade ago, people warned us that, people are going to say stuff about different folk, that, apartments are going to attract people who are different from us. And what we found was that it's a very, very different scale that Edina uses from any other suburb we've ever been in. What people are worried about with respect to apartments isn't a racial component at all. And we do see a racial component in about just, we could name the inner ring and second ring suburbs right around Hennepin County. But what is key here is when we ask people, what does it mean? When you think of the term people like me, what are you looking for? Or what do you think that entails? Very rarely, it's been 2% and 3% when we've asked that over the past decade. People say same race. Now we might say, okay, in Minnesota we're all trained to be politically correct. By the time we ask this in a survey though, we've gone through maybe 50, 60 questions, and what we found is that they're so comfortable with our interviewers that they're willing to tell us about, and have in some cases, their drunken brother-in-law, and all sorts of issues that you wouldn't think come up that suddenly spill. What is key here is, are your apartments going to be low-income apartments? Mm-hmm. It's not a racial basis at all. It's more of a class basis here.
And that's where I was kind of trying to get at, is the concern sort of the affordable housing, or is it density alone, or was there any indication?
Density's the big part to it.
Okay.
But your residents are not opposed to affordable housing. I mean, they're still looking. They want to make sure that their kids can move back in, so they'd like to see starter homes here. Not necessarily starter apartments, but starter homes. And they want to make sure that there's some place when they retire that they can move out of their house and still stay in the community.
Any questions of the committee? Kevin?
Why were there no survey questions having to do with transit options as part of a mixed-use development on the site? Because some of our principles included the possibility of park and ride, retaining access for future light rail stations. That wasn't part of your survey.
Well, I don't think there's really any debate. That's a solid part of the framework that's going to be there. I mean, I shouldn't speak for everyone, but we're really trying to get to where it's sort of the, this discussion of, in the framework we talked about public uses, that's a broad term. So trying to define, what does the community think when they think about public uses? when you talk about transit, or, you know, it seems more like we all know what that is, and it's planned to be there in this area.
Well, park and ride would be a very easily understood concept for people to say whether they thought it had a place as part of a mixed use, reuse of this site.
Yeah, I mean, Park and Ride might have
But if
been
you
one
don't
just to
ask
get
about
a.
it, it has zero support if you never ask a question at all pertaining to those type of things. So it seems like we automatically move that issue down to the bottom of the pile because it was not brought up as a potential use or option.
When the steering committee sat down to talk about what kind of questions to ask, we were really looking more on uses, not on how they're accessed or what the complementary amenity is, but really focusing on, you know, community centers and community-type facilities and mixed uses and what might work together well and what might not work together. So that was really the focus. And I would agree with Mike that there was, you know, regarding the rest of the framework, that really wasn't within the purview of this questionnaire.
Other questions?
I noticed that at the end, geographically, that everything neatly broke into quarters or quadrants. Is that,
We
did
intentionally
you
did
do
it.
quadrants by, so you did randomly within each quadrant to make sure you got the same number of respondents at the end?
Exactly.
Oh.
We
so
do
you're
capture
good,
their
not
addresses.
lucky, right?
Well, we're lucky within the quadrant, but we do that just to make sure that we've got adequate coverage all the way around.
That we're not just calling around Southdale or.
Do you notice, you know, you had the slide about familiarity with Grandview and use of Grandview. Did that vary dramatically among the quadrants?
The familiarity was
Yeah,
widespread
that really
throughout
was
the
widespread.
community. I mean, the further away from Grandview you were, the more likely you were to say somewhat familiar instead of very familiar.
And then use-wise, the rare would be the further away.
Exactly.
And the premium would be right in there.
Exactly. That's where we saw distance come into
That
play.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Piggyback on what he said, did you see trends with people who used it more frequently with desires?
I'm sorry, I missed the front.
Did we
People
see?
who would use Grandview more often, was there a trend in the desires they want for community spaces there, since they're probably gonna be the ones using it more often?
That washed out as a significant variable at that point.
Yeah, a third, it does kind of, taking this and overlaying it onto the potential uses, I'd have to go back honestly, but nothing jumped out when we were looking through the crosstabs on that.
That just seems pretty beneficial.
Seems like that would, I think.
So,
So the question at the start, 93% of people said a strong sense of community is important to them. Were there any marginal comments or, I mean, anything, you said that's the highest you've seen when there's questions, kind of questions been asked? Any idea why? And what we could take from that?
Oh, I've for a long time thought, in the surveys we do for the city, that your welcome wagon, when someone moves in, brings a basket, and in the basket is welcome to Edina. We're a wonderful community, an excellent quality of life, and
schools.
and never forget it. And because the quality of life and the second dimension is pride of place, are way above any other community we survey in. The quality of life rating here has always been head and shoulders above any other suburban community. Although a couple of now are catching you.
what? Who are they? I need names.
Yeah.
I want.
The city knows.